Welcome to At Issue. Thank you for joining us. My name is H. Wayne Wilson, and it is a time of political transition. This time it might be considered a little bit different than normal. Every 4 years we have transition, or maybe every 8 years. And this one's a little bit different. We're going to see if we can't make sense out of this with some experts in the field of politics. We've invited 3 professors in to the studio to talk about the federal election and a little bit about the state, but we're going to focus on the federal election with Dr. Carl Palmer. He is a assistant professor of politics and government at Illinois State University. I get that right?
Sir.
Okay. And also joining us, Dr. Ed Burmilla. Dr. Burmilla is an assistant professor of political science at Bradley University. And Dr. Carrie Melita is here. Dr. Melita also is at Illinois State University, where she is in the Government and Politics Department. Mm-hmm. Thank you all 3 for joining us. And I don't know where to start, except that is there a way, Dr. Burmilla, to characterize this campaign that just concluded? It seems a little different, or is it?
It was a highly unusual campaign. One of the strangest things I think we saw on election night was, I believe it was a CNN person asking the Trump campaign staff how they felt they were doing with independents in Pennsylvania and Ohio, because obviously that was going to be very important to them. And they just kind of guessed at it and said, oh, I think we're doing all right. So you don't have any data on that? You don't have any numbers? You know, what is your team on the ground in Pennsylvania said? I just never thought of doing that, right? So it's a very interesting race in the sense that by not campaigning and coming ahead with a victory, you know, what does that tell candidates in the future about all of these things we think we know about what campaigns are supposed to do?
There didn't seem to be much of a structure to the campaign. It was like whatever spur of the moment thought that Mr. Trump had, he tossed it out there, and for whatever reason it worked.
I couldn't shake the feeling throughout the race, and you guys can probably weigh in on that as well, that he was always surprised that he was surprised he won the nomination, surprised that he was doing well in the campaign. It always seemed as though he began this without the expectation that he was actually going to win, but picked that up as he went along.
Carl Palmer, you're shaking your head yes.
Well, I mean, I think we were all surprised. I mean, you would expect that, given it was such an unconventional campaign, that we, the experts, we should be surprised that these things work because they. But you know, I know when Trump first entered the race, I said he'll be out in 6 weeks. There's no way that he's going to make any traction, and so you know he managed to shock the world. But I think that Ed's exactly right. That Trump never seemed to have any expectation. He was getting into it for the entertainment, maybe to push an agenda, and every time that there was a vote, that he kept doing better and better.
But might he, the joy for him might have been in the hunt, and now what am I going to do? I was elected president.
It turns out it's a pretty difficult job. You can see the before and after pictures of presidents throughout history. It's a hard job that requires long hours and takes a toll on people. I don't know Donald Trump personally. I do know a little bit about his background. I've read some of his biographies and autobiographies, and I do know that a long attention span is not one of his assets, right? Without getting into any sort of judgment about whether or not he's a good candidate or a bad candidate, he's somebody who likes to keep things fresh and do something new every couple of years and move on to a new challenge. Oh, I'll buy an airline this year. How about that, right? So he's always moving on to something, and it'll be interesting to see him try to make that transition into devoting himself full time to what the job is going to demand of him.
Carl mentioned that he said he'll be out in 6 weeks. He'll never make it. The polls, Carrie, were somewhat like that. Mm-hmm. What went wrong?
I don't think it was that the polls went wrong. The polls used the same scientifically sound methodology that they've always used. I think the difference was this year when we called people and asked them who they're going to vote for, there was, I don't want to say that people were lying, because there was kind of this universal stigma this year of saying that you were a Trump supporter, that a lot of people wouldn't admit to that, and then on the privacy of the ballot booth, then they decided to do that. So I don't think it was that polling is wrong, that we need to change polling. I think this might have been something unique to this particular cultural of the election.
And another thing that I think goes along with that, with the polling, and we had a chance to mention this earlier, the polls tend to, and we've known this for a while, exaggerate the number of people who are going to vote for a third-party candidate. People say they're going to, and I think with polling, all we can really do is take people at their word, right? Because if we're going to decide, well, she said Trump, but I don't believe her, then what was the point of even asking, right? But we have voters who look at Trump, maybe they are lifelong Republicans who thought this guy is too far away from the rest of the party for me. So they tell themselves, this year I'm going to vote for Gary Johnson instead. But by the time the ballot or the election rolls around, partisanship is a very strong influence on people's behavior. They get the ballot in front of them. They see the candidate with the R next to their name that they've been voting for 40 or 50 years maybe, and they revert to their habits, right? So they might even believe up until the final moment when they vote that they are going to vote for Gary Johnson, but obviously at 2 or 3%, versus the 8 to 10% he was polling at for most of the season, we see there's obviously a discrepancy between the amount of support those people thought they were going to direct to Johnson and what actually happened.
Carl, was there a bit of, and that obviously the numbers dictate that, because Gary Johnson only polled 2.5 to 3%, but was it a case of, okay, I can't throw my vote away, quote unquote, I can't throw it away to Jill Stein or Gary Johnson, so I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to vote for, and that makes polling tough, but was that the case, do you think?
I can imagine that dynamic did occur in the minds of a lot of voters. And we had two candidates that had the lowest net favorability at least as long as we've been measuring net favorability. And so it's very easy to say, well, I don't want to vote for either of them or vote for a third-party candidate. But ultimately, in the end, it's very rare that those votes actually produce a meaningful outcome. I mean, maybe if you're lucky, you get, you might be able to get your party a high enough proportion of the votes to qualify for federal funding. But generally speaking, those votes are just protest votes. And so I think and as Ed said, that partisanship is such a strong force, and it just leads people to just come back home and vote for the party that they identify with.
So let's move to a Trump administration, and I'm going to ask you to get out the crystal ball. And we as a society haven't been very good using the crystal ball this time around. But there are some early indication of what Trump might be like as a president by who he is picking and the types of things he's proposing to Paul Ryan, to Mitch McConnell, et cetera. Do we have a feel yet this early as to what we might see out of a Trump administration? I
think there's still a lot of noise in that prediction as to who he's going to be as president. His first 100 days agenda, I felt, was surprisingly bipartisan. The top agenda was ethics reform. Now, that's not something that's going to go over too well with either of the parties in Congress, right? Because that's going to take away a lot of their advantage in fundraising and elections. But ethics reform, I think that's at least a nice effort. It's not these kind of egregious things that he had said along the campaign trail. Most of those are nowhere to be found in the first 100 days agenda. So I would say maybe a softer side of Trump.
Is there a softer side to Trump?
There's most likely is. We might not see it because he's so conscious of what his persona is in public. But I would agree that the agenda that he put out is more wide-ranging than most of his campaign rhetoric was. I would be surprised if much of it actually made its way into concrete legislative proposals. I think what we're ultimately going to get out of that very broad first 100 days agenda is we're going to get the tax cuts, which of course the Republicans in Congress will want to vote for, and probably some measure toward immigration reform, because those are going to be the most likely things for the Republican leadership in Congress to want to work with him on.
One of the primary issues that Mr. Trump brought up was the question of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. Do you see an avenue for that, and what might have you seen any evidence of something that might replace it?
And this is the difficulty is in making predictions about how Donald Trump is going to be as president, because we really don't know much about his specific policy proposals outside of the first 100 days. I mean, we can't really pinpoint just how conservative he actually is. He has said on the campaign trail that he's going to immediately come in, tear up the Affordable Care Act, and replace it with something that looks more like a competitive model where you can buy insurance across state lines. And that's something that would likely be much preferred by the Republicans in Congress. But as far as the actual specifics beyond that, I don't think we really have that.
He has already indicated that he is prepared to nominate Myron Ebell as the head of the EPA. And he is with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, very conservative. He is a skeptic. Some might call him a denier of climate change. I don't know whether this is a one-time only, type, okay, the rest of them are going to be more moderate. But is this an early indication that he's going to go outside the typical box? Or
Well, one of the things that I think is most surprising, there were a lot of instances throughout this campaign where we noticed that the reality around him and the words that come out of his mouth weren't quite lining up. And he's always talking about surrounding himself with the best people and with winners. And then you look and see people like Newt Gingrich, who hasn't won anything in 20 years, and Sarah Palin, and these kind of people who don't exactly inspire feelings that they are really the best people you could find to do the job. Ebell at least has some background in the issue. I think his personal views on it are a little strange, but he does have experience working with the issue and some knowledge of it. Some of the other names that have been bandied about by him is, high-ranking appointments make you a little bit skeptical that these are really honestly the best people we can find, or as opposed to simply being people he feels comfortable with.
with that in mind, because he has zero political experience, and this will be the first time, and I can't remember, I don't even know how far back you go to find somebody with the equivalent experience. What about the learning curve for him? Is he going to have a difficult time adjusting to that type of work environment? There were some that suggested the only thing he knew about Washington, D.C. was his hotel. So this is a new environment for him.
Yeah, businessmen, when they go into politics, we haven't seen it like this where they've gone on to be president before, but we've certainly seen where successful businessmen have gone on to the state legislature, to Congress, and they tend not to do too well when they get there because they're not used to compromise. They're not used to the give and take. They're kind of used to setting out probably, a great, fantastic agenda and having everyone go along with it. And when that doesn't happen, they don't do as well. So.
Carl, were you going to add something?
It reminds me a little bit of when Eisenhower took over, and one of his lieutenant generals from his time in the Army said he's going to hate being president because when you're a general and you give orders, people have to follow them, right? When you're the CEO of a big company like our governor, you're used to people doing what you tell them to. And as president, there's more to it than simply barking out orders and having people follow them.
And that's an interesting point about Eisenhower because I believe it's 12 times now in our history, Eisenhower being the most recent, that we've elected a general as president of the United States. Back in the 1800s, that might have been a little different scenario in terms of effectiveness, but a general coming in, this is what we're going to do. I'm the general. It's a completely different environment. I think we need to talk about the Freedom Caucus, the Tea Party. Where do you think Trump stands with regard to the cooperation of the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Party?
Well, I think it's hard to gauge. I mean, during the campaign, we saw so many Republicans either refuse to endorse him or dance away from the endorsement as he said varying things or other things came out about Trump. And so I think on first glance, it'd be easy to say that he's going to have a very uneasy relationship, not just with the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus, but with the entire Republican caucus. And there's going to have to be a lot of back and forth, give and take. I mean, maybe some of them will say he's our president, will fall in lockstep, but I can't imagine it's going to be that easy for him.
Well, he can't use the tactic that he used during the campaign when he called everybody names. So that's not going to work for him, I don't think, very well. Well,
I mean, he could try and see. I mean, it got him elected, so maybe it'll get him his legislation through.
We've been talking more somewhat about specifics. Can we just sit back and take a broad view and maybe go around the table and Ed, starting with you, what is your expectation of a Trump administration?
Well, I think that what we see right now is something that certainly in my lifetime we're not used to seeing in American politics, and that's a high degree of uncertainty. Nobody really knows what we're going to get here, right? And that's not something we're used to having to deal with. We could see other examples of elections where people were as agitated or angry about the outcome as this one. We go back to 2000, for example. Democrats were very unhappy with the outcome, but you knew what you were going to get with George W. Bush. He was a bone stock conservative Republican. We knew 95% of the things you would imagine to be present with any conservative Republican were going to be found with him. So there was no moment where we said, what's going to happen next? With Trump, you can't really take anything off the table, right? Things that with Hillary Clinton, for example, you might say, oh, she would never do that. With Trump, you have to leave the option open. So we're used to operating in this range of possible outcomes where we know nothing outside of that is going to happen. Now the potential that something outside of that could happen exists, and we're not used to having to deal with that.
Carl?
I would completely agree, and I think one of the first indicators we'll have of what we can start to expect from Trump is one, who he chooses to fill his cabinet with, and as he builds his administration. But two, I think that the most telling litmus test will be when he actually moves to fill the vacant seat in the Supreme Court, is that will give us a sense just how conservative he's leaning. Now, it's not going to be a perfect predictor because he may be doing that to satisfy his constituency or try to have a nominee that will actually go through and not have either moderate Republicans or the Democrats filibuster. But I think that'll be one of the key indicator of what we can expect from a Trump presidency.
And what about you, Carrie?
I would definitely agree. There'll be a lot less noise in our expectations just as soon as we see the people that he's surrounded himself with. I think his administration is one where he himself does not have a unique identity as who he's going to be as president, so who he surrounds himself with will largely set the tone for the type of president that he ends up being.
I'm not an executive branch expert, but I have the feeling that this is going to be one of the most important chief of staff selections of all time.
Yeah.
That person is going to have a tremendous amount, whether he realizes it or not, that person is going to have a tremendous amount of influence in driving where his presidency is going to go.
Absolutely. And one wonders who he picks since he burned through campaign managers so quickly. And Kellyanne Conway managed to stick, but so I don't know does that mean that she is first in line or?
But might the chief of staff be the one who drives decision making because Trump, as I think you mentioned, doesn't have that attention span and he's new to the game of politics? Might they have more of a influence than some of the past chief of staff?
Well, someone like Kellyanne Conway seems to be the worst possible choice he could make, not because I object to her personally, but he needs somebody who understands the way the system works from the inside that he doesn't have by his own admission, right? He's coming at this from an outsider. He is going to need a chief of staff who can function at a high level and will be able to tell him, if you want to do A and B, you need to do X and Y in order to accomplish that, because he's coming at this just completely as a blank slate.
Before we go to state, just for a few minutes, we'll go to state issues, but voter turnout wasn't exactly what we had expected. And did that cost Hillary Clinton the election?
I mean, you could easily say that is when you're comparing turnout for Hillary compared to turnout for Obama in 2012, and she dramatically underperformed in the key areas where you would expect that she would have racked up the votes. And it's not surprising to see that turnout was lower, given that we had two very unpopular candidates.
For a few moments, let's talk about the state of Illinois. Does anyone? The Republicans gained a couple seats in the House. I think 2 in the Senate. So maybe 3 in the House, 2 in the Senate. Does it make any difference in the overall mix? Carl, if you want to start.
And I think that one thing you could say is that it has, it has taken away the Democrats' supermajority in the chambers. And so with that, maybe there will be a little more pressure for compromise, but it doesn't seem like that much is going to change.
But because Rauner has said we're going to have a budget based upon making some changes like tort reform, etc. Is Madigan going to allow that, even with fewer votes in the House?
It seems unlikely to me. I think that Mike Madigan can outweigh most elected officials in this state. He knows that Governor Rauner in 2018 is going to have to run for re-election, and if he doesn't get some results soonish in the next, say, year, when he's going to need to, at the end of 2017, be looking ahead to the 2018 campaign. I think if Governor Rauner doesn't have something to show for his first 3 years at that point, he knows he's in big trouble, and Mike Madigan knows that too.
The most immediate concern is they only passed a 6-month budget on July 1st. That's coming up. We have a veto session. Anybody have a stab as to what might happen come January? Or is that even more of a crystal ball than guessing what Trump might do?
That's definitely a challenge. I mean, my gut says that somehow they'll come together and kick the can down the road and give us another short-term budget, similarly to what happened a few years ago at the national level when the Democrats and Republicans finally came together to avoid the debt ceiling issue. Is that they'll put a little stopgap measure in and then go back to staring at each other and basically not doing anything.
Carrie, I'd like to talk about people complain about Springfield. We're unhappy they don't pass a balanced budget, they don't do this, they don't do that. And yet, when it comes to the ballot box, 72 of the races in the House, 118 seats total, 72 had no opponent, and only a handful of those remaining 40-some had viable races. So do we as voters really have much of a choice when it comes to changing the way Springfield is working?
Well, with the number of uncontested races, it makes it very difficult to get new blood in. And most people really like their legislator, and it's the same exact thing you see with Congress. People love their congressmen, but they hate Congress. People love their state legislator, but they hate Springfield. And the big reason for that is these elected officials, they cultivate very strong relationships with the community. They bring special pork projects back. This road really needed to be paved. This bridge was falling into the river, and now it's not, so that's wonderful. And that makes us really like our individual representatives, but then everybody as a whole becomes the problem.
We become very good at convincing ourselves that you're doing a great job as my congressperson, but those other 434 people in Congress are holding you back. We tell ourselves that so we can hold those two ideas of liking our representative, but not liking the whole institution at the same time.
And I'll throw this out just in general. What's the prospect of any 3 times redistricting reform has failed? Rauner's calling for term limits. These issues have never had any traction, at least not in the courts. Is there any hope for either one of those finding some sort of traction in the near future?
I mean, unless the parties and the party leadership become suddenly incredibly altruistic and wants to make it harder for them to keep their jobs, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Most of the literature in our field and the evidence that we have suggests that term limits don't achieve the desired outcome, that what we gain in new blood, we lose in institutional knowledge. And we're constantly bringing in essentially a never-ending freshman class of legislators who spend more time trying to figure out how the process works than they do actually legislating.
It's interesting you should mention that because I visited Nebraska and they have 2 4-year terms and that's it. It's a unicameral legislature. And to the number on individual interviews, they said it's the staff who's making the recommendations on legislation because we don't have enough institutional knowledge, we don't have enough knowledge about how the system works. So there may be a point there. But your take on either redistricting or the question of term limits?
Oh, this is a pessimistic answer. I mean, I think it's unlikely. Both are unlikely to happen at the state level or at the DC level. Sorry, Trump. But if they did, I don't think it would make any difference. That's kind of fatalistic, but it is what it is.
Well, on that high note, we've run out of time. So let me say, and I hope you continue the conversation at home. It was meant to stimulate your thoughts. And we want to say thank you very much to both Carl Palmer and to Carrie Melita, who are assistant professors at Illinois State University in the Department of Government and political science. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And also from Bradley University, thank you to Dr. Ed Bermilla,
Thanks for
who
having me.
is a assistant professor of political science there at Bradley. So thank you very much for being with us. We'll be back next week with another edition of At Issue. This time, we're going to be talking about newspapers, but not the Peoria Journal-Star, not the Galesburg Register-Mail, not the Panagraph over in Bloomington Normal. We're going to talk about small-town newspapers and the impact they have on residents in their community. Join us for that conversation next time on At Issue.